Hi, welcome to Writing with Yvonne. On this episode, I'm going to be talking to you about putting together a poetry collection. If you've been writing for a while and you've got a body of poems, maybe about 40, that you think represent your strongest work, and maybe you think they fit together on a distinctive theme, it might be time for you to think about starting to put together your first poetry collection. And I was in that position myself a few years ago, and through trial and a lot of error, I finally got to the point where I was publishing my first book, Burning Season, which came out with Blood Axe Books. One of my students said to me, "Burning Season from Blood Axe, that's so metal." And I really laughed because I thought that was very, very funny. But the thing is, what's interesting is that you might think that somebody's book kind of surfaces as this magical object after a mysterious load of successes. In my case, that was definitely not the case at all. I pitched to publishers and I was not successful. I had weak poems that I pulled out of the manuscript. I messed around and tinkered with the order, and there was a long process involved in actually getting to the finished product. And what made things a bit difficult for me and for so many people all around the world was the pandemic got in the way of a lot of things. And what that meant was that authors were not able to go to book signings in person, because what people quite like is if they hear you read, they come up to you at the end, they buy your book and they ask you to sign it. We couldn't have any of that during COVID. And the result was that a lot of publishers actually paused submissions and they wouldn't take anything on. So there was that challenge to negotiate, but with a bit of luck, we're not going to have that problem again anytime soon. So when it comes to putting my body of work together, at first I was clueless. I really did not know what I was doing, and I had a very strong sense of imposter syndrome. I was quite shy about putting a book out into the world because I knew it was a big step up from what I had done previously. A lot of poetry publishers, in the UK anyway, will expect you to have had a pamphlet or chapbook out and a track record of getting poems published in literary magazines and journals. Once you have got a body of work together, it's time to think about how you would go about ordering a collection. I wanted this to happen years before I think my work was actually ready. And I can remember, 10 years before I actually published it, really wanting to jump the gun. But I hadn't gone through the process of getting together a lot of magazine publications. I hadn't gone through the process of entering my work for many competitions. I hadn't started editing and reviewing. All those things put together helped me to feel not that I was writing and my writing was going away into a folder. It helped me to feel that I had a bit more of a career as a poet. And it earned me next to no money. I was able to afford a couple of cups of coffee back then with what I was getting from reviewing, but I did it as a labour of love, really, and because I wanted to get a book out. It was during the pandemic that I was thinking seriously about pitching to publishers. I'd been really lucky, so I applied for loads of mentoring schemes, loads of talent development schemes. There was one that the Arvin Foundation ran that I applied for 3 times before I finally got it. So I was very, very stubborn, and I knew that having that kind of mentoring scheme under my belt would be good because it would help me to refine my work and help me to approach publishers. But of course, it is possible to talk to critical friends. It is possible to join a writers group. It's possible to have a mentor or a PhD supervisor or an MA supervisor. Any of those people can help to guide you with your work. And mentoring is one of the things I love to do most in the world. And I had this stack of poems together, and my mentor was saying, "I think you should start pitching to publishers soon. We've come to the end of the mentoring scheme. Go and talk to editors. Go and start trying to pitch." So I did. And the way I went about ordering the body of work was I put together all the strongest, most distinctive poems, the poems that nobody but me could have written. There's one poem that emerged quite early in my career called Muirburn, which I think is characteristic of my work. And when I was first ordering my poems and trying to sequence them, I didn't even have a title for my manuscript, which is quite embarrassing. I really wanted to collate the work and I didn't know what I was going to call the collection, but my poem Muirburn told me the title of the manuscript. I took The Burning Season, or Burning Season, as the title of the rest of my manuscript. It fitted thematically, and for me as a writer who is environmentally minded, it suggested the time of climate change as well, as an era or as a time period. So I felt that worked well. So it was interesting that one of my most distinctive poems that I was happy with and proud of told me the title of a wider body of work. So a critical friend, a really, really brilliant writer, Zafar Kunial, somebody I'd known for a long time and trusted with my work, said, print out all your poems, put them down on the floor and start arranging them in piles. See which ones go together, which ones grate against each other, and you can play them either for similarity or contrast. And he had all sorts of absolutely brilliant strategies. He said, you write with the 4 elements, fire and the earth and rocks and the wind and the sea feature in your work. Arrange your poems according to the 4 elements. And he wasn't necessarily suggesting that could be the final structure of the book. He was saying it was an organising principle I could think about. Another thing he advised me to do was to take the work of poets I really admired and the work of authors who put together a really, really beautifully made collection as an artefact where all the poems are effectively chiming together as if the book is one long single poem. He said, get Sylvia Plath's Ariel and get Philip Larkin's High Windows and put them on your desk. And he said, do this not necessarily because you're going to keep rereading them all the time. You've read them. Just put them there as reminders, as if the quality of those poets' work could rub off on yours, right? As if they were a kind of like a form of blessing. And I thought that was a really, really interesting way of looking at poetry collections as artefacts. I picked up a few tricks from poets I admired a lot. So the writer Pascal Petit is somebody whose work I think is absolutely brilliant. And Pascal would tell me things like, prize judges are going to focus on the first 6 books in your collection. Make sure that those are really, really good ones. People are going to turn to your title poem, the title poem of your whole book. So make sure that one is a particularly strong and weighty poem because it's going to take a lot of emphasis. Make sure that the last poem in the book is a good one and it is the note that you end the book on. So think about letting it linger in the reader's mind. Think about it maybe as being a doorway into a future collection of yours. So yeah, I was definitely daunted by this whole process because I put together pamphlets or chapbooks and quite often they had a very tight focus and I knew exactly what I was doing because I was writing on one theme. But with a poetry collection, I knew I would need 40 poems or more, and it was going to be a slightly longer process. So I didn't have any idea what I was doing, or I didn't really have faith in what I was doing, but other people encouraged me and I was lucky to be able to do that. And I can remember sitting outside my flat, and we had a carpeted area outside our flats in the block I lived in. It was like a little landing. And because it was the most space I had, and because other people weren't going to look over my shoulder and read my stuff, it was a very quiet area. I scattered all my poems around. I grouped them into piles. I grouped them according to theme, and that was how I figured out how they worked best together. Now, I feel that I would not have been satisfied with my book if I had put all the poems together in chronological order, in the order I wrote or published them. I don't think that would have worked for my particular project. If I had just put together my pamphlets or chapbooks and I put them side by side without altering the order, and I don't think it would have worked too well either if I had thought, oh well, that poem came out in a magazine I like, therefore I'm not going to do any more work to it. I think poems are abandoned, not finished. So I was always open to thinking, okay, well, I wrote that one a few years ago. Maybe it needs a little bit of tinkering with. Oh, I've put two poems together and they have the same word, and I feel like I'm not varying my vocabulary very much. I'm going to vary this now so that they work a little bit better. But there are a few organising principles for my book. One of them is that there is a narrative that goes from destruction and from the age of fossil fuels, and that's an industry that a lot of members of my family were involved with, towards something that's a lot more ecologically minded, a lot more resilient, a lot fiercer in its defence of all things that live and grow. And there's a sequence of poems that I've threaded through my book, and they're prose poems, and they're about planting acorns. So this is based on some things that I actually did. So during lockdown, there was nothing to do. So many people took up weird lockdown hobbies, like some people started growing mushrooms from kits. I grew tomatoes on a balcony. I grew lettuces that got infested with aphids. I was really quite bad at looking after the plants. And I grew some acorns from seed. I wanted to grow some little oak saplings. And as soon as we had a bit more freedom to move around, I planted them out on a moorland. So part of the trajectory of my collection is to look at the industries that my father worked in. So my dad was a petroleum engineer, and of course our energy economy was dependent on oil for so long. It's still the driver of many decisions, some of them quite violent. It is a reason as well why people go to war. And I wanted to look at the tension between the values of my father's generation, which would have been very pragmatic, which would have seen fossil fuels as essential sources of energy, and the values of people who grew up, like me, with cartoons like Captain Planet on the TV, and who thought, well, actually, hang on, this is a polluting process. Do we not need to question this? What can we do that might be more environmentally responsible? And another organising principle for my book is that there are poems that look at fire as a destructive force and poems that look more at regeneration. In fact, my poems are almost paired or twinned. I have a long poem called In Oils towards the beginning of my book, which remembers the stories about the Gulf War that I used to hear when I was a child growing up in Kuwait. The Gulf War had happened prior to my time there, but it was very, very prominent in people's memories. It was also in the media, it was in films, it was in TV, it was in stories people at my school told each other. It was in things that my dad's colleagues discussed. So people were aware of this as a very, very recent event. And that poem In Oils deliberately contrasts with the other long poem in the book, which is called Waterland. And they're very different in form. There are some kind of rebel sonnets, informal sonnets in the sequence In Oils. And in Waterland, I cut loose. The prose is much more flowy, the form shifts, and you can see me taking an approach that's maybe a little bit like The Wasteland. And I can remember we had to read The Wasteland when we were undergraduates at university. My dad had a very, very large manuscript edition of The Wasteland when I was a kid. I didn't understand a darn thing when I tried to read it when I was much younger. It was completely incomprehensible, but something about it must have filtered down into my brain when I was a bit younger. And I think, we would be lying if we pretended that we were not building on the work of earlier authors and inspired by that earlier work. In terms of other pairings, I have a poem called The Gift, which is about picking up a very, very simple plastic pen and acknowledging that it comes from oil. It comes from a combustion process that makes soot for commercial ink. The ink comes from petrochemicals. And the pen itself is an artifact that is linked to all sorts of industrial processes and also to war. The contrasting poem in my collection is called Rhyme, and it's about the speaker's beloved who picks a blade of grass that has become frozen. It's got frost on it, and they're writing a bit like they're using a rush for a pen. So you have a kind of hot, fiery environment where industrial processes are manufacturing a pen and writing. And then you have a cold scene on a hillside where somebody is using a frozen reed for writing. And there's a more destructive, more compromised poem that I see as a mirror image of a more generative and resilient poem that also hopes that winter will stay for all the animals that we have out there on the mountains who are dependent on the cold that they are used to in their particular zones on the mountain. So there's a whole series of poems that almost act as mirror images, and there's a mirrored structure in my book. There are a lot of other things threaded through it besides that, but one of the things that I had in mind as a structuring principle was that the poems were mirror images. The title poem, Burning Season, came very late in the process. I thought I needed a poem where fire was more domestic, where I focused more on bonfire building. It's also quite a haunted and ghostly poem, and I wrote it quite belatedly, really. And I've noticed a shift in my own style, even in the space of the book and in the space of trying to improve my practice as a writer. So when I was first starting out, my poems were quite confined. Formally, they were quite neat. They were orderly, they were fairly uniform. As I developed a little bit more, I was not afraid to cut loose slightly more. I didn't mind longer, more flowy lines. I didn't mind bits of dialogue and language that sounded a bit more like spoken language, like throwaway remarks that characters make in the poems. And I was open to that. And I'm sure it came with confidence. Definitely when I first started out, maybe I was either editing very, very hard because I felt like I had something to prove, or I was almost holding myself back as a writer. And I've learned a lot through the process of putting a book together. It's very, very interesting, and it's fascinating to see how other people do it as well. There are a lot of poets whose books I admire, and if you're looking to start putting a first collection together, a good way of doing it is to look at books that you already admire and think, okay, why have they placed this poem with that poem? Are they contrasting a long poem with a short poem? Are they using a very formal poem like a villanelle against a very free verse type form for contrast? Are they contrasting a poem that is written more from the head with the intellect in mind against a poem that is more to do with the heart? Is there a poem sequence where there's a theme or an organising principle and the poems are together? Or are they sprinkling parts of a sequence throughout the body of work? There are so many different ways of doing this. It's all as individual as a fingerprint, or as individual as any writer's practice. It's a very personal thing. But it's interesting to look at the ways that other people do it. Something I really like doing when I'm working with my students and when I'm working for candidates who I mentor is to talk about the way that they structure a body of work and the way that they put the poems together. And sometimes having the eyes of a critical friend on your body of work can be very, very helpful, because an editor may be able to spot things that you yourself can't spot. I know that definitely when I show my poems to friends, certainly they come up with stuff that I would never even have noticed. I love mentoring. It's one of the most rewarding things I have ever done for other writers. If you would like to work with me, just get in touch.